Based upon the statement of the paramedics, and you're calling it at 12:57, is there a protocol for how long the person has to have been unresponsive to resuscitation efforts before you authorize it to be called?
The Los Angeles County EMS protocol
Yes.
requires that with 20 minutes of resuscitation and no change, that it is appropriate and within the purview of the base physician to authorize a pronouncement.
Okay, and is that protocol based upon the fact that 20 minutes of no change with eyes dilated and fixed, there is no hope?
It is unlikely that further resuscitative efforts would be effective in changing the outcome.
You did an hour and 13 minutes of extra resuscitation efforts at the medical center after he got there.
Yes.
Was that because it was Michael Jackson as opposed to someone else?
No.
So any person coming in off the street, you'd have done the same thing that you did this day?
I have performed very aggressive attempts at resuscitation if I thought there was some information that I needed and to confirm that everything was done, yes.
Have you ever done that on a person whom you've authorized an hour and a half before declaring them dead? You've already authorized them to be declared dead?
This is the first time when I've authorized a pronouncement that there was any change, any request for change or request by the paramedics to not sort of hold on to that authorization and ask for further treatment.
So whenever you've authorized the code to be declared in the field, you've never had a person brought to the hospital?
I wouldn't say that specifically. I will get involved and I will authorize it is okay to do a pronouncement in the field. If the paramedics are uncomfortable with that pronouncement, if there are family members on scene who are uncomfortable and the paramedics feel that the family would prefer and does not understand, then I will, listen to the paramedics and say that they do not need to pronounce, but they do need to start to transport.
Okay, but you've never worked on a patient in the emergency room that you've authorized to be called in the field?
No.
That's a double negative. Can we clarify it?
You have never...
Have you ever, please?
Okay, have you ever worked on a patient in the medical room that you've authorized their death to be determined in the field?
I have never given a time of death in the field and then had that patient brought to me in the emergency department until June 25th.
And so it was a relatively... And the reason why you did it in this particular case is because the patient had a physician not wanting you to give up.
Yes.
And when he was talking to you about and answering your questions, was he telling you, please do not give up?
I do not believe we had any such conversation, but he very well may have said, I do not know.
Did he, now, you indicated you just didn't recall the demeanor, but if I were to use terms like frantic, did he look frantic?
I don't recall him being frantic, but to be honest, I work in an emergency department with critical situations. People respond differently, particularly people who do not typically work in the emergency department. And I don't pay that much attention unless someone is really upset and I need to make sure someone's comforting them. It's sort of, when I'm dealing with a code, it's not really my priority.
And so when you say that you don't recall, you really just don't recall anything about his demeanor whatsoever.
I recall speaking to him. I assume when I was speaking to him that I was getting honest and truthful answers. He was respectful of the emergency department and, my residents, and not attempting to, when I told him that, he was not going to be allowed to do procedures. But I was not really particularly paying attention to his demeanor to be able to comment 2 years later, no.
Were you there when they used the aortic pump?
Yes.
And that was at the request of Dr. Murray?
Dr. Murray and the cardiologist attending, Dr. Cruz, had a conversation. I believe it was about 40 minutes in. There was a discussion with the team because resuscitative efforts had failed and appeared to be futile. Dr. Murray had a separate conversation with Dr. Cruz, of which I was not listening to and did not hear that there was a discussion, and then following, the intra-aortic balloon pump was placed.
I didn't understand. You trailed off the very last
Sorry.
minute.
They had a separate conversation that I did not hear, and a decision was made as a final attempt to perform the intra-aortic balloon pump.
That wasn't at your recommendation then?
I was not involved in the discussion or the decision.
You indicated that there was the condom catheter was in place. Was there urine?
No.
Are you sure there was no urine whatsoever?
I could look at my note. I believe it's commented there, and then the nurse code note would also report urine, but I do not believe there was any urine in the collection bag.
Had there been, would you have taken it for purposes of sampling?
Yes.
I have nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
Mr. Flanagan, thank you. Redirect examination, Mr. Walden.
Thank you. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Dr. Cooper, first of all, to be clear, your handwritten notes are part of a very thick packet of medical records documenting the care that UCLA provided to Mr. Jackson, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and this is just one note that you made. Well, it's actually a multiple-page, 6-page note, but this is just one aspect of those medical records.
Correct.
Okay. And the portion Mr. Flanagan was referring to, if you could, can you read from this third line down to after it states patient arrest? Can you read that out loud, what you noted on that day?
There was no history of drug abuse by the patient as reported by Dr. Murray. The events surrounding the arrest reported by Dr. Murray was that he had placed an IV and given the patient 2 milligrams of lorazepam IV sometime earlier in the day. Dr. Murray then administered a second 2 milligram IV dose of lorazepam and reports witnessing the patient arrest.
Okay. And that's one aspect of the notes that you documented regarding what was relayed to you by Conrad Murray.
Correct.
Okay. And it's important to maintain medical records and to have such notes to reference in case called upon days later or even years later.
Correct.
Okay. And it's part of standard protocol for doctors to make medical notations and to maintain charts and records of vital signs and dosages so that information is readily available, correct?
Correct.
And you would have liked to have been provided such documents by Conrad Murray on June 25th, 2009, correct?
It potentially would have been helpful, yes.
And you had indicated in your conversations with Conrad Murray, you were assuming that he was not lying to you, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you asked him, I think your initial question was, what happened, right?
Yes.
And that's a pretty open-ended question.
Yes, it is.
Okay. And what he told you was primarily in that first conversation was that Michael had been working hard, he was dehydrated, and then he relayed the information about the lorazepam, correct?
Correct.
And made no mention of propofol.
Correct.
Okay. Now, Mr. Flanagan asked you a lot of questions about propofol and your use of propofol in the hospital. You actually are qualified and have specific privileges that allows you personally to do propofol at UCLA, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, that's not something that every doctor at UCLA is qualified or privileged to do.
That would be a correct statement.
Okay. And in every scenario where you've given propofol for procedural sedation or otherwise, is it fair to say it is done in a room as depicted in 48 with all the necessary medical and monitoring equipment?
This is a picture of our trauma bay, not our typical emergency department room, but procedural sedation would be performed in a room in which there would be a monitor and the patient would be on the monitor, and airway equipment would be in the room, oxygen, any equipment we would need to deal with any complication is in the room and set up.
Okay, you would have all the necessary medical monitoring equipment, monitoring the heart, monitoring oxygen saturation levels, blood pressure, capnography, all of those types of monitors, correct?
Respiratory rate, yes.
Okay. You'd have all the resuscitative drugs on hand should they be necessary?
The resuscitative equipment, typically with procedural sedation, the problem is if a patient is too sedated, they have respiratory depression and they stop breathing. So we have code drugs, not necessarily right in the room, but we have the equipment to manage and handle the airway in the room and set up at the time we will do procedural sedation.
All the airway equipment already there and available should it be necessary?
Yes.
Okay. And all the staff that you've described before with particular people assigned particular tasks?
In procedural sedation, there is a nurse who is assigned to monitor the patient. In our department, our policy is the attending is present throughout for every procedural sedation, regardless of whether it's propofol or a different agent that's used. And then there would be separate physicians to perform the procedure.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Mr. Walgren, thank you. Recross-examination, Mr. Flanagan.
And the amount of propofol that you use in procedural sedation, you said that you would start out with 1 milligram per kilogram.
Objection, gone scope, asked and answered.
I'll allow counsel to reopen within the limits. Overruled. You may answer it.
That would be a typical starting dose.
And with the intent of achieving what amount of sedation?
A level of sedation such that the patient would not be aware or not having pain while we're doing a procedure that would then facilitate us performing the procedure more quickly and more successfully. But a level of sedation, ideally, that does not result in the patient stopping breathing.
Okay. Now, you would never use a dose of less than 0.5 milligram per kilogram, would you?
In a patient who had not received any other medications, who had no other medical problems, was healthy and alert,
Right.
I do not suspect that in someone who is not elderly, in someone who's elderly, I may start with a much smaller dose, but in general, no, I would generally start with 1 milligram per kilogram would be my typical practice.
Because based upon your experience, you wouldn't expect to achieve sedation with 25 milligrams on a 60-kilogram patient.
25 milligrams of propofol alone in a healthy 60, I would not expect that to achieve sedation, no.
Okay. And when you use it for procedural sedation, do you put it in all at once or do you infuse it over a period of time?
The physician will infuse propofol, and we will do it as sort of a slow bolus over a minute, minute and a half.
Okay, so you don't just push it all in at once?
No.
Because that can cause apnea, can it?
In a sufficient dose, yes.